Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the armchair historian. Of all the current world leaders, none seem as incapable of ignoring the international spotlight as Vladimir Putin. From relatively humble beginnings, as the third and only surviving son of a naval conscript and factory worker, Putin would climb the ever-shifting power structure, first the Soviet Union, and then the Russian Federation, until finally claiming his place as leader of one of the largest, most powerful nations. But Putin's rise to prominence amongst his peers is inextricably linked with the Chechen Wars, a series of conflicts fought over control of the country of Chechnya in the northern Caucasus. In this video, we'll be examining the Second Chechen War and exploring how Putin's careful political schemes exploited the unstable region to both expand the scope of Russian influence and enable his own ascension to the highest office in the nation. In a region as ethnically diverse as the Caucasus, being able to understand and communicate with the local population is vitally important, especially during long military campaigns. In such situations, misunderstandings and miscommunication due to language differences can often be an obstacle to achieving strategic objectives. It's for this reason that I'm excited to thank the sponsor of today's video, Speak.ly. Speak.ly is a language learning app designed to help you learn languages up to 5 times faster than conventional methods. Uniquely, the app lets you choose your own study methods, focusing on vocabulary, writing, multiple choice options, or a combination of the three. Available on both web and mobile devices, Speak.ly is accessible anywhere at any time, giving you a streamlined learning process that can be customized according to your needs. You can try Speak.ly today with a free 7-day trial and get a 60% discount on an annual subscription. Support our channel, learn a new language, and sign up for Speak.ly using our link in the description below. During the chaotic first years of the post-Soviet era, the small and fairly insignificant breakaway Chechen Republic of Chechnya was mostly left to its own devices, while President Boris Yeltsin struggled to create a viable Russian government and stabilize the economy. But Yeltsin always kept the region in the back of his mind, fearing that other Russian republics would use Chechnya's example to make their own bids for freedom. Chechnya was utterly plagued with crime and corruption to such an extent ethnic Russians were leaving in droves, and by November of 1994, Yeltsin authorized the use of disguised military personnel to overthrow the government, then openly resorted to force after this attempt failed. But Yeltsin's hope of a brief, easy intervention were dashed when the poorly coordinated Russian advance on the capital city of Grozny was stalled for days by a motley collection of Chechen troops, volunteers, and foreign mercenaries. Even when Grozny fell, the Chechens simply began a protracted guerrilla war in the countryside. The Chechen president at the time was Zikar Dadayev, a veteran of the Soviet-Afghan War who knew exactly how to counter the Federation offensives. While much of the field actions were organized by a military officer and hardline Muslim extremist named Shamil Basayev, who had close ties with the Mujahideen. Though guilty of blatant acts of terrorism against the Russian people, Basayev would go on to serve as the chairman of Chechnya after Yeltsin was forced to sign the Catapulted Accords in 1996. These accords brought hostilities to an end, but left the status of Chechnya in a gray area that both sides knew would only cause future conflict. 1996 was also an election year in Russia, and thanks to the bungled war effort, the increasingly unpopular and unhealthy Boris Yeltsin urgently needed support against his political rivals. Enter Vladimir Putin, an unassuming former KGB agent brought on to assist Yeltsin's campaign. For the next 7 months, the powerful Moscow oligarchs savaged each other in the political arena, while Putin discreetly toiled in the background. In 1997, a successfully re-elected Yeltsin promoted him to chief of the main control directorate of the Presidential Property Management Department and deputy chief of the presidential staff. This gave Putin wide-reaching authority to investigate government corruption, which he prosecuted with a selective diligence that always conveniently benefited the Yeltsin administration. The connections he forged via these investigations would earn him many friends and equally as many enemies, and were instrumental in his appointment to the directorship of the Federal Security Service in 1998 and the office of Prime Minister in August 1999. After Yeltsin fired his previous prime minister, an entire political cabinet for the 4th time. But while Putin was busy amassing power with Yeltsin's presidency, Shamil Basayev was plotting to destroy it. On August 7th, Basayev and fellow Muslim extremist Ibn al-Khattab led a 1,400-strong Islamist insurgency into the neighboring Republic of Dagestan, intending to establish a new Chechen Dagestan Islamic Republic. Putin used the conflict to divert attention away from his increasingly noisy whistleblowers and vocal critics within the Russian government. Having already begun emerging from Yeltsin's shadow, Putin now asked the president for absolute power to coordinate the Russian response to Dagestan. Yeltsin and the rest of the Russian Duma agreed, and Putin threw himself into proving that the Russian Federation still had its teeth. Within a month, the dream of an Islamic Republic had been trampled into the dust by the boots of nearly 20,000 Russian soldiers, backed up by artillery, airstrikes, and even a small number of shiny new T-90 main battle tanks. But just as war seemed to be wrapping up early in September, a series of explosions rocked apartment complexes across Moscow and Volgodonsk. Putin had intelligence assets in Chechnya, and these swiftly blamed Ibn al-Khattab for the deaths of at least 293 innocent Russian civilians. The explosions also outraged the nation, and the spirit of righteous indignation was expertly channeled by Putin's rhetoric at the time, and his popularity skyrocketed when he began aggressively calling for retribution against Chechnya. The issue was that the president of Chechnya, Aslan Muskatov, was absolutely desperate to avoid another war. In August, Russian planes had entered Chechen airspace and bombed retreating Mujahideen, but Muskatov refused to retaliate. While Putin prepared to attack, Muskatov was practically screaming his desire to negotiate from the nearest rooftop, going so far as to repeatedly try to telephone Yeltsin personally, only to be ignored at every turn. Of course, absolutely none of this mattered to Putin, and on the 30th of September, 90,000 Russian soldiers thundered across the border into northern Chechnya, now led by experienced veterans of the First Chechen War. The Russians reacted to urban guerrilla warfare by simply flattening every piece of available cover with gratuitous amounts of artillery fire and airstrikes. The local Chechen village elders were politely told to expel any rebels and submit to occupation, or have their settlements declared terrorist bases and subsequently bombed to rubble. By early November, the Russians were advancing across the Terek River, straight towards Grozny, to surround it and blast the defenders into submission with overwhelming firepower. On the 12th, Gudermas, the second largest city in Chechnya, fell to the advance, and just a few weeks later, the first troops reached the outskirts of Grozny and began the siege. Over the next 2 months, Grozny was subjected to constant bombardment, while Russian troops secured strategic positions in the suburbs and skirmished with their Chechen counterparts, who often tried disguising themselves in Russian uniforms during nighttime raids. In early December, the nearby city of Argonne fell after significant resistance that left several hundred Russians dead or wounded. With its capture, Grozny was surrounded, and the real attack could begin. The Russian plan of attack involved dividing Grozny into 15 sectors, reconnoitered one by one to identify enemy strongholds. These would then be subjected to long-range bombardment before sappers created safe corridors for infantry to secure the sector. The bulk of the street fighting would be done by loyalist Chechen militia under the command of a former mayor of Grozny, Bislan Gontamirov. Backing up the militia were 2 MVD brigades and several units of the feared Russian Special Forces operatives, the Spetsnaz. The operation was intended to reduce the mobility of Chechen defenders and create a spider web of Russian-controlled areas throughout the city. After this web had been woven around Grozny, storm detachments of 30-50 men would break up pockets of serious resistance, while the militia would mop up the stragglers. Each detachment also had access to sniper rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, and the terrifying Shmel RPOA flamethrower. On the 24th of December, the first Russian soldiers advanced into Grozny, escorted closely by tanks and backed up by BMP infantry, fighting vehicles that also acted as field ambulances. With so much firepower at their disposal, the Russians avoided close combat whenever possible, instead marking clusters of resistance for elimination by mortar and artillery barrages. The first reports of the battle to reach the Russian media were glowingly positive, describing the occupation of huge swaths of Grozny and virtually no direct confrontations with the enemy. But in reality, the fighting was vicious, hectic, and extremely intense. Guerrilla fighters were constantly sneaking past the siege lines to reinforce their comrades in the city, and were far more numerous and determined than expected. The Chechen militia complained they were left unsupported during engagements, and the Russian troops often failed to adequately secure sectors before moving on, resulting in territory captured one day being lost the next day. The worst fighting occurred in January of the new year, as both sides grappled for control over Manatka Square, surrounded by 5 to 9-story buildings that made ideal positioning for snipers. Long-range duels were interspersed by frantic close quarters combat as Chechens used tunnels and hidden crawl spaces to infiltrate Russian lines. The tallest building in Grozny was also located near the square and changed hands multiple times throughout the month. But while Chechen control over Grozny was slowly eroding, Putin's control over the Russian government had become absolute. After nearly a decade of struggling with severe alcoholism and heart disease, Yeltsin had decided not to stand for re-election in the year 2000. But Yeltsin was in a conundrum, as the office of president was the only thing protecting him from the vast horde of extremely rich enemies he had acquired. In late 1999, Yeltsin summoned Putin to his private residence and made a deal. In exchange for resigning and letting Putin become the acting president for the rest of his term, Putin would grant Yeltsin immunity from prosecution when he left the office. Yeltsin resigned on New Year's Eve, and that very evening, Putin traveled to Dagestan and made speeches affirming his commitment to the war effort, including the quote, "This is not just about restoring Russia's honor and dignity. It's about putting an end to the breakup of the Russian Federation." Their resolve strengthened by the knowledge that they were now led by a relatively young, healthy, and highly energetic leader, instead of the aging, sickly, and horribly unpopular Yeltsin. Russian troops continued to push into the Chechen capital. By January, Grozny had earned the highly prestigious title of the most battle-damaged city since the Second World War, with vast sections having been utterly obliterated by weeks of Russian shelling. Early January saw the fiercest fighting yet, as the Chechen rebels mounted a last-ditch counteroffensive that saw guerrillas popping up behind enemy lines in Argon, Gundermes, and Shaley. By this point, Russian paranoia was at an all-time high, and there are many allegations of Federation soldiers indiscriminately murdering civilians to root out disguised insurgents or simply out of sheer frustration at the continued Chechen defiance. Just as it became clear Grozny was a lost cause, Shamil Basayev arrived to personally coordinate a breakout attempt through the vast Russian minefield encircling the city. On the 29th, Basayev and his officers led the way through the mines, marking the way for their beleaguered subordinates. Though many were wounded, the majority were able to escape, leaving the capital once again in the hands of the invaders. But this retreat infuriated Muscatov, who had hoped to negotiate with the Russian officials, while Grozny still held. To make matters worse, many survivors of the battle crossed the border into neutral Georgia, which the Russians cheerfully used as an excuse to conduct airstrikes into Georgian territory. This sent a clear message to other nations in the Caucasus, demonstrating that Putin would not tolerate even passive cooperation with Chechnya, dashing Muscatov's hopes of forming a coalition in the region. Even the Americans cynically exploited the situation for their own benefit, making a great show of offering aid to the innocent Georgians, while paying lip service at best to Chechnya. Alone, isolated, and forced to rely on wanted terrorists for the defense of his country, Muscatov was in an untenable situation. His every attempt at peace talks were sabotaged by Muslim radicals, and the legitimacy of his government had been forever tainted by his association with men like Basayev and Al-Khattab. Having seized the capital, the Russian army now spread out into the countryside to conduct mopping-up operations. Most remaining pockets of opposition were holed up in the mountainous regions in the south of the country, such as Shatoy and Vidino. But even the largest of these consisted of a few hundred men at most, and their ability to resist amounted to acts of sabotage and terrorism designed to make life as annoying for the occupiers as possible. While the Chechen insurgency clung to the faint hope of victory, Vladimir Putin was being sworn in as president of the Russian Federation. His policies in Chechnya had been carefully spun by the media as the actions of a man determined to weld the various fragmentary parts of the Union back into a united, cohesive whole. Thanks to this, Putin secured an easy 53% of the popular vote. Just 2 months after his victory, Putin placed Chechnya under direct rule, with a hand-picked pro-Russian government taking office in the blasted ruins of Grozny. But the real government of Chechnya persisted, with Muscatov continuing to try and represent his nation to the best of his abilities while in exile. However, his credibility would be constantly sabotaged, particularly by the events of 9/11. Almost as soon as the attack occurred, Putin called President Bush, ostensibly to express condolences, but also taking the time to imply a link between the Chechen resistance and Al-Qaeda. By planting such seeds of doubt, Putin was able to keep international pressure off of Russia, while leaving the Chechen government isolated. Muscatov's last gasp came in 2002, when Al-Khattab was assassinated by a poisoned letter. By far the most extreme member of the resistance, Al-Khattab's death indirectly gave Muscatov the political capital needed to bring the eternally bickering Chechen guerrillas together one last time. Naturally, Basayev chose this exact moment to claim responsibility for a hostage-taking at the Nord-Ost Theater in Moscow. Since he was still commander-in-chief of Chechnya's armed forces, this extremely public link to a terrorist attack that resulted in hundreds of innocent deaths destroyed Muscatov's dream of negotiation once and for all. Basayev would leave the Chechen government shortly thereafter, but not before him and Muscadov publicly denounced each other as Russian double agents. 2002 was also the year the Russian army handed over combat duties against the insurgents to locally appointed militia groups made up of Chechen loyalists. In October of 2003, the Chechen government installed by Russian-elected Ahmad Kadyrov as president. Kadyrov oversaw a referendum on the constitution, which included a motion to reintegrate with the Russian Federation. Debate over the wording of the constitution was forbidden, and over 80,000 Russian soldiers were also allowed to vote, rendering the proceedings farcical. To further emphasize just how little power the puppet government had, Kadyrov was killed in an explosion at Grozny Stadium in 2004, and the Kremlin reacted by putting his son, Ramzan, through an emergency political education as his father's eventual successor. 2004 also saw Aslan Muscadov's death, as he was tracked down by Russian special forces and killed by a grenade blast. Shamil Basayev would last until 2006, when he too met an explosive end by accidentally triggering a mine while attempting to disarm it. For various reasons, it is impossible to definitively determine when the Second Chechen War came to an end. Remnants of the insurgency continue operating to this day, and fragments of the Ichkeria government still cling to legitimacy in secluded corners of the Caucasus. However, most place the end of the conventional conflict as occurring shortly after the fall of Grozny, while anti-terrorist operations continued into the late 2000s. It is estimated that to this date, around 7,000 Russians have been killed in combat with insurgents in exchange for around 16,000 Chechen casualties. The civilian toll is up to 10 times higher, with both sides accused of extensive war crimes against innocents and acts of terrorism by Chechen extremists, having killed at least 600 Russians outside the borders of Chechnya itself.